The glass didn't just crack. It shattered. A sharp, violent snap that cut straight through the low hum of the Manhattan rain outside. My grandfather's vintage gold pocket watch, the only thing he had left of his own father, slammed against the heavy mahogany conference table before tumbling onto the cold, polished floor. The glass face exploded into 100 glittering shards, scattering across the dark wood, grazing the tips of my black pumps. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I just stared at the floor as a heavy, pristine silence filled the penthouse boardroom of Pendleton Holdings. Then came the sound of a leather sole grinding into the floor. My half-brother, Julian, deliberately stepped forward, his custom Oxford shoe crushing a silver-framed photograph of my grandfather and me right into the debris. He didn't look down. He looked at me, a smug, alcohol-infused grin spreading across his face as he swirled a glass of Macallan 25 in his right hand. "Oops," Julian drawled, his voice dripping with an insufferable, mocking arrogance. "My bad, Elena. But honestly, you need to stop clinging to garbage. The old man is in the ground. His sentimental trinkets don't mean a damn thing anymore. This room, this building, that chair you're standing next to. It all belongs to us now." Next to him, sitting comfortably in the high-backed leather throne that used to belong to my grandfather, was Victoria, my stepmother. She didn't look like a grieving widow. Not even close. She was draped in a tailored Chanel suit, her neck blindingly bright with a flawless 5-carat diamond necklace, purchased, no doubt, using the family trust's emergency liquidity fund just 48 hours after the funeral. She elegantly set down a thick, leather-bound document on the table, sliding it toward me with a manicured finger. The sharp click of her diamond ring against the wood sounded like a gunshot. "Sign the waiver, Elena," Victoria said, her tone smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of human empathy. "Sign away your claims to the estate, hand over the deed certificates to the Long Island commercial properties, and walk away. If you don't, my lawyers will have a warrant for your arrest by 9 a.m. tomorrow morning for corporate embezzlement. Don't test me, child. You have nothing left here. Take a good look at this scene. Feel the suffocating weight in this room. On one side you have me, Elena Pendleton, a forensic financial analyst who gave up 5 years of my life, working 80-hour weeks, bleeding for this company to protect my grandfather's legacy while his health faded. I am standing here alone, dressed in a plain charcoal gray suit, my hands buried deep inside my pockets so they won't see the raw, bruising tension in my knuckles. On the other side you have 2 apex predators, 2 parasites who never broke a single sweat for this empire. Yet the moment the old man's heart stopped beating, they swooped in like vultures to strip the flesh from the bone. They didn't just want the money. They wanted to see me break. They wanted to humiliate me, to strip away my dignity, and to throw me out onto the rain-slick streets of New York City with absolutely nothing. They had spent the last 3 weeks orchestrating a flawless corporate coup. They bribed the attending physicians to alter the medical logs, claiming my grandfather lacked testamentary capacity during his final months. They locked me out of the main database, changed the security codes to the family mansion, and left me completely isolated. I wasn't even allowed to sit in the front row at his funeral. To the rest of the world, they painted me as an ungrateful, money-hungry outcast who was trying to bleed her grieving family dry. The pain inside my chest was a physical, throbbing ache, a burning pressure that threatened to choke me. But my mind was ice cold. In the brutal world of New York high finance, the person who throws the first punch always loses. Anger is a luxury I couldn't afford. I slowly knelt down, my knees pressing against the hard floor, and carefully picked up the ruined pocket watch. The sharp edge of a broken glass shard sliced into my thumb, a bright bead of crimson blood blooming against the gold casing. I didn't care. I squeezed the watch tightly in my palm, absorbing the sting, using the physical pain to anchor my focus. I stood back up, my spine perfectly straight, my face a mask of absolute professional calmness. I looked Victoria dead in the eye. "You really want me to sign everything over? No court battle? No mediation? Just a total voluntary surrender of the primary deeds?" Victoria let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed uncomfortably against the glass walls. "Surrender? Let's call it what it is, Elena. It's an eviction. You're a pathogen, and we are simply sanitizing the family business. Julian, give her the pin. Let's see if her Harvard education taught her how to sign her own surrender." Julian chucked a heavy gold pin across the table. It rolled and stopped right against my bleeding hand. To them, I was a defeated animal. A broken little girl cornered by the wolves. They thought they had won. They thought their wealth and ruthlessness had bought them total victory. But as I looked at the pen, and then at the dark, greedy glint in their eyes, a tiny, invisible spark ignited deep within me. They wanted a surrender. I was about to give them exactly what they asked for. But this wasn't my ending. This was the first, calculated step of their execution. The true cruelty of a predator doesn't show when they attack. It shows when they slowly, methodically starve you to death. By Monday morning, the trap Victoria and Julian set for me didn't just close. It tightened until I could barely breathe. It started at exactly 7:15 a.m. with a violent, repetitive buzzing from my phone. A red alert notification from Chase Bank flashed across the screen. Account status frozen. Every single dollar of my personal savings, the money I had earned through my own salary, was locked tight. The legal justification attached to the freeze order was a devastating piece of paperwork filed by Arthur Vance, Victoria's high-priced, cutthroat fixer of a lawyer. The document alleged reasonable suspicion of illicit asset diversion from Pendleton Holdings into my private accounts during my grandfather's final days. Before I could even process the shock, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a Google alert with my name attached to it. A prominent New York tabloid had just published a digital article with a headline that made my stomach drop into a bottomless pit. The Mad Heiress. Internal scandals rock Pendleton Holdings as unstable daughter faces criminal embezzlement charges. Right beneath the headline was a grainy, unauthorized photo of me walking out of a psychiatric clinic in Upper Manhattan from 2 years ago. A time when I was privately battling severe clinical depression after losing my mother. They had bought the medical records. They had weaponized my deepest, most vulnerable human grief, twisted it into a narrative of mental incompetence, and splashed it across the internet for millions of people to consume and mock. By noon, the isolation was total. I tried calling old family friends, people who had sat at our dinner table for Thanksgiving, people who had promised my grandfather they would always look out for me. Every single call went straight to voicemail. The few colleagues who did answer spoke in hurried, terrified whispers before abruptly hanging up. "I'm sorry, Elena, it's just, Vance is threatening to blackball anyone who associates with you. We can't get involved." I was a ghost in my own city. I was toxic. The psychological warfare reached its absolute peak when a heavy white envelope was slipped under the door of my small rented apartment in Brooklyn. The return address bore the gold-embossed logo of Vance & Associates, LLC. Inside was a formal, chilling ultimatum. The language was cold, precise, and designed to induce pure terror. It stated that if I did not present myself at the executive boardroom by Friday afternoon to sign a quitclaim deed and an absolute waiver of all trust interests, they would file a formal criminal complaint with the district attorney's office. They were going to destroy my career, strip away my financial license, and ensure I spent the next 10 years of my life in a federal penitentiary. I sat on the edge of my unmade bed, the harsh afternoon sun cutting through the blinds, casting long cage-like shadows across the floor. The sheer, suffocating injustice of it all felt like a physical weight crushing my lungs. I looked at the framed photograph of my grandfather on my nightstand. How could people who shared the same blood be this monstrous? How could a system built on law be so easily manipulated by those with enough money to buy the best liars in the city? That was the exact moment I started digging through my personal hard drives, looking for anything, any small detail they might have overlooked in their rush to destroy me. And that was when the final crushing illusion of family blew up in my face. As I reviewed the historical digital ledgers of the family's offshore holding companies, I discovered a hidden trail of transactions dating back more than 5 years. Julian hadn't just started stealing after my grandfather got sick. He and Victoria had been systematically bleeding the family trust dry for half a decade. They had set up a complex web of shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands, using the company's prime commercial real estate as collateral to secure massive, predatory loans. Why? To fund Julian's catastrophic gambling debts in Macau and Victoria's disastrous luxury resort investments in the Caribbean. Every single smile they gave me over the holiday dinners, every time Victoria patted my hand and told me I was doing a wonderful job with the company accounts, it was all a calculated, sickening performance. They were using my meticulous financial work as a smokescreen to cover up their multi-million-dollar fraud. They didn't love my grandfather. They didn't care about the legacy. They were just waiting for his body to get cold, so they could use me as the ultimate scapegoat for their financial crimes. As I sat there staring at the damning data on my screen, my phone lit up with an incoming audio file. It was a voicemail from Julian. I pressed play, and his voice filled the quiet, empty room, dripping with an oily, triumphant venom that made my skin crawl. "Hey, little sister," Julian chuckled, the sound of ice clinking in a glass audible in the background. "Just wanted to make sure you got Mr. Vance's little love letter. Look, let's stop pretending you have a move left on the board. You've got no money, no lawyers, and by tomorrow, you won't even have a reputation left in this town. You think you're so smart with your Harvard degree and your little spreadsheets? Out here in the real world, cash is king, and power dictates the truth. You're nothing but a broke, crazy girl living in a dingy apartment. Do yourself a favor. Show up on Friday, sign the papers, and maybe, just maybe, I'll convince Mom to give you a few $1,000 so you can move to some flyover state and start over. Don't be a hero, Elena. You lost." The voicemail clicked off. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and charged with a dark electric tension. Anyone else would have broken. Anyone else would have curled up into a ball, consumed by panic, tears, and a total sense of helplessness. The injustice was so unfair, so deeply evil, it was enough to make you lose all faith in humanity. But as Julian's mocking laughter faded from the room, a profound, terrifying calm washed over me. My heart rate slowed down. My hands stopped shaking. The youth and despair didn't break me. It forged me into something else entirely. Julian thought he was the apex predator because he had the money and the muscle. He thought he had backed a terrified Coney into a corner. He had no idea he had just unleashed a monster of pure, calculated intellect. He wanted me to show up on Friday. He wanted me to sign those deeds. Oh, I was going to show up. And I was going to hand over every single asset exactly as he demanded. They wanted to play a game of power and greed? Fine. I was about to give them a masterclass in how a real architect operates. The voicemail clicked off, leaving a cold, dead silence in my tiny Brooklyn apartment. Julian's mocking laughter still seemed to vibrate off the peeling wallpaper. I didn't move for a long time. I just looked at the cracked face of my grandfather's gold pocket watch resting on my desk. My thumb was still bleeding slightly. I smeared a tiny drop of crimson across the tarnished metal casing. Then my eyes caught something I had never noticed before. A microscopic indentation near the winding stem. A hidden seam. My breath hitched. I walked over to my kitchen cabinet, pulled out a precision jewelry screwdriver kit, and carefully pried the backplate open. It popped with a soft metallic click. Inside, nestled neatly in a hollowed-out compartment where the gears should have been, was a sleek black microSD card. It wasn't a family heirloom. It was a digital weapon. I slotted the tiny card into a heavily encrypted, off-grid burner laptop I kept for private audit work. The screen flared to life, illuminating the darkroom in a pale blue glow. A single directory appeared, titled, The Master Blueprint. My fingers flew across the keyboard. As file after file unzipped, the crushing weight of the past 3 weeks began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, surgical adrenaline. This wasn't a collection of memories. It was a comprehensive, devastating legal dossier compiled by my grandfather and Arthur Sterling, the brilliant, old-school family attorney whom Victoria had ruthlessly fired the moment the old man was hospitalized. They had anticipated every single move. They knew about the fake wills, the bribed doctors, and the hostile corporate coup. More importantly, they had laid an invisible, catastrophic financial minefield right under the assets Victoria and Julian were starving to steal. I clicked on a document labeled Executive Deliverables and hit print. The small machine in the corner began to hum, spitting out pages of an obscure, specialized IRS tax filing alongside a clean, unformatted contract titled Absolute Asset Assumption Agreement. Why print a voluntary surrender document myself? The answer was buried deep within the encrypted files. The dossier revealed a shocking truth that would make any Wall Street shark's blood run cold. The 3 massive commercial buildings in Manhattan, the crown jewels Julian was bragging about, were not the gold mines they appeared to be. Years ago, my grandfather had strategically cross-collateralized those properties against a series of high-risk, toxic offshore debt bonds. On paper, the buildings looked pristine. In reality, they were legally tied to a massive financial black hole that was currently under a silent, deep-dive investigation by the federal government. I reached into my bag, pulled out a cheap, prepaid burner phone bought with cash, and typed a short, coded message to an unlisted Washington, D.C. number. The contact belonged to a senior chief investigator at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, a man my grandfather had secretly aided years ago. I hit send and watched the message vanish into the network. The carrot was being positioned. The encrypted screen flashed again, revealing the next layer of the trap. The luxury resort in the Hamptons, the asset Julian desperately needed to liquidate, contained a hidden Tier 3 cross-default trigger clause with Deutsche Bank. If the property changed hands without a comprehensive federal tax clearance certificate, the entire $50 million mortgage would automatically accelerate, becoming due in full within 30 days. Julian had no idea he was about to inherit a financial execution order. It was time to play my part in their theater of greed. I picked up my primary phone, my fingers mimicking a slight tremble as I dialed Julian's direct line. When he answered, the loud, obnoxious thumping of a nightclub bass echoed through the receiver. I took a deep, shaky breath, letting out a soft, rehearsed sigh that practically bled desperation. "Julian," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly on cue. I can't do this anymore. The papers are destroying my sanity. I'm ready to sign everything over on Friday afternoon. Please promise me you'll tell Vance to drop the embezzlement charges. I just need a few days to pack up my life and find a place to go." On the other end, I heard him muffling the speaker to shout to Victoria, "The bitch is breaking." He came back on, his tone dripping with patronizing victory. "Smart move, Elena. Friday at 2 o'clock. Don't be late." I hung up and immediately went to work. I packed my grandfather's old leather-bound journals into a plain cardboard box, walked down the street to an automated FedEx kiosk, and shipped them to an untraceable P.O. box in Queens under a fake name. They wouldn't find a single shred of his personal history left in that office. The master blueprint outlined the exact mechanism of the coup de grace. The absolute asset assumption agreement I was preparing wasn't just a standard transfer document. It contained a specific, highly aggressive clause that explicitly stated the new owners accepted all historical, current, and latent legal and tax liabilities of the entities, effectively piercing their own corporate veil. By signing it to avoid a public court fight, Julian and Victoria would legally convert corporate tax evasion into personal, non-dischargeable debt. They were begging for the crown, completely blind to the fact that it was wired with high-voltage electricity. I checked my watch, grabbed a dark trench coat, and walked out into the brisk New York air. I bought a one-way subway ticket to Lower Manhattan, but intentionally stepped off 3 stations early, slipping into the crowded, anonymous chaos of a subterranean diner. I needed to stay off any grid their high-priced private investigators might be monitoring. As I sat in a dim corner booth, waiting, I reviewed the final piece of the financial puzzle. The Long Island commercial properties were saddled with a retroactive environmental penalty clause from a forgotten industrial chemical spill in the 90s. The state had quietly issued a conditional lien that remained dormant, as long as the original corporate structure stayed intact. The moment a change of control occurred via a standard quitclaim deed, the lien would activate, compounding interest exponentially at a punitive rate of 18% annually. A shadow fell over the table. I looked up and handed the thick manila folder containing the freshly printed agreements to the gray-haired man who had just sat down opposite me. It was Arthur Sterling. His eyes, sharp as flint despite his age, skimmed the documents. A slow, mysterious smile crept across his weathered face, a look of profound, quiet satisfaction. "They think they're playing checkers, Elena," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that sent a chill of anticipation down my spine. "But you just put them in a multidimensional checkmate before they even made their first move. Let's give them their prize." While the trap was being meticulously calibrated in that dim subterranean diner, the upper echelons of Manhattan society were treated to a sickening display of unearned triumph. Julian and Victoria didn't just celebrate. They weaponized their newfound status on social media. I spent my nights watching their digital footprints from a secure browser. Page 6 featured a glaring headline about a private VIP party, at an exclusive club in the meatpacking district. There was Julian, surrounded by high-rolling sycophants, popping bottles of vintage Ace of Spades champagne that cost more than a family's annual mortgage payment. His Instagram stories were a continuous loop of obnoxious luxury, panoramic views from a private jet charter to Miami, gold-plated watches glinting in strobe lights, and captions dripping with arrogance. The empire is under new management. Out with the dead weight, in with the real players. They were spending money they hadn't legally secured yet, completely drunk on the illusion of absolute power. Victoria's arrogance took a more permanent, destructive form. She didn't even wait for the Friday meeting to begin dismantling my grandfather's physical legacy. According to an inside contact who still worked in security, she hired an elite interior design firm to completely gut his historic executive suite on the top floor of Pendleton Holdings. Priceless first edition books were tossed into cardboard boxes like trash. The classic mahogany desk, where my grandfather had negotiated deals that built the Manhattan skyline, was hauled out to make room for a gaudy, minimalist white marble table with gold leaf accents. Victoria wanted every trace of the old guard wiped clean. She was already redecorating her kingdom, convinced that the quiet girl in the charcoal suit had been completely broken by the media onslaught and the frozen bank accounts. To her, I was an afterthought, a minor legal nuisance that had already been successfully neutralized by her brilliant attorney Arthur Vance. But the ultimate manifestation of their blind greed occurred on Wednesday afternoon. Julian's debts to the high-stakes casino syndicates in Macau had caught up with him, and the pressure from his international creditors was turning dangerous. Desperate for immediate liquid cash, he did something incredibly reckless. He secretly met with a high-profile, aggressive Russian investment consortium at a luxury hotel in Midtown. Believing that my total surrender on Friday was an absolute certainty, Julian signed a binding letter of intent to sell the entire Hamptons luxury resort asset to them for a cash payout of $85 million. He even accepted a non-refundable $10 million advance deposit to clear his immediate gambling markers. He was selling a property he didn't legally own yet, committing himself to a massive international transaction based entirely on the assumption that I was too terrified of prison to fight back. His greed had completely bypassed his judgment. The contrast between their world and mine could not have been more extreme. While they basked in the flashing lights of Manhattan nightlife, I spent 72 straight hours in the cramped, windowless basement office of Arthur Sterling's private residence. The air tasted of stale coffee and ink. The only illumination came from 3 high-definition monitors displaying endless lines of corporate tax code, title registries, and cross-collateralized loan structures. I didn't sleep. I didn't change my clothes. My focus was entirely consumed by the mathematical precision of the counterstrike. Alongside 2 elite, forensic auditors who had remained fiercely loyal to my grandfather, we mapped out every single dollar Julian had illegally siphoned over the years. We didn't create a fake narrative. We simply organized the brutal, unvarnished truth into a legal framework that would crush them. We were binding their personal financial identities to the very corporate entities they had corrupted. This was where the fatal flaw of the antagonist became our greatest asset. Arthur Vance, their highly paid legal fixer, was a man consumed by his own reputation. He had spent his entire career bullying independent heirs into submission through intimidation and media smears. He was so incredibly arrogant, so completely convinced of his own intellectual superiority, that he committed the ultimate cardinal sin of the legal profession. He completely skipped the due diligence phase. He didn't bother to run a comprehensive, independent title search or an updated lien check on the Manhattan buildings or the Hamptons resort before drafting the final transfer papers. Why would he? In his mind, I was a broken, panicked girl who was signing the quitclaim deeds under the extreme duress of an impending criminal indictment. He assumed the assets were exactly as they appeared on the surface. He was too busy calculating his own 5% cut of Julian's impending $85 million Russian deal to do his actual job. Blinded by this total contempt for my capabilities, Vance made a critical, irreversible mistake. On Thursday morning, he called my burner phone, his voice dripping with condescending authority. "Elena, we're moving the timeline up," he demanded, not even bothering to greet me. "Julian and Victoria are busy people, and we don't feel like waiting until Friday afternoon." You will present yourself at the family estate boardroom tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock sharp. I have the standard quitclaim deeds ready, but to ensure you don't try any legal stunts later, we've added a mandatory absolute asset assumption agreement to the packet. You sign it, or the district attorney gets the embezzlement file before noon. Don't play games with me. I paused for a beat, letting a manufactured gasp slip through the microphone, pretending to choke back tears of terror. Please, Mr. Vance. Okay, I'll be there. Just don't ruin my life. I hung up and looked at Sterling. The trap had just set itself. Vance had actually done our work for us. By insisting on adding the absolute asset assumption agreement to the transfer packet to permanently seal my mouth, he had unwittingly integrated the exact legal mechanism we needed into their own execution documents. They were so eager to completely strip me of my inheritance that they were forcing me to hand them the very weapon that would destroy them. They had no idea that the IRS Criminal Investigation Division had already finalized their federal warrants based on the data I provided, waiting for the exact moment ownership legally transferred to trigger the arrests. The stage was now completely set. The contrast was absolute. A family blinded by unearned luxury, an arrogant lawyer intoxicated by his own power, and a silent girl who had spent her entire life mastering the rules of a game they didn't even realize they were playing. The countdown had reached 0. Friday morning had finally arrived. The grandfather clock in the corner of the Pendleton Estate boardroom ticked with a heavy, rhythmic monotony. It was exactly 10 o'clock on Friday morning. The room was suffocatingly formal, lined with dark walnut paneling and illuminated by a massive crystal chandelier that cast a sharp, unforgiving glare over the long conference table. This wasn't a standard corporate office. This was the inner sanctum of the family empire. A place where generations of Pendletons had secured their legacy. Today it felt like an execution chamber. Sitting at the head of the table was Judge Marcus Reynolds, a retired federal probate judge whose reputation for absolute integrity was legendary in the New York legal circuit. His silver hair caught the light as he sat perfectly still, his cold, gray eyes scanning the legal documents laid out before him. Victoria had insisted on his presence, believing his impeccable reputation would permanently legitimize my total surrender. Victoria and Julian sat across from him, practically radiating a sense of toxic, untouchable royalty. Julian was wearing a bespoke three-piece charcoal suit, his fingers drumming a restless, arrogant beat on the table. The heavy, musky scent of his expensive Tom Ford cologne filled the air, mixed with the faint aroma of the morning whiskey he had undoubtedly consumed to celebrate. Victoria sat next to him, her fingers intertwined, her freshly manicured nails painted a deep, blood red. Every piece of jewelry she wore, the diamond studs, the platinum bracelet, seemed like a trophy stolen from my grandfather's life. Behind them stood Richard Vance, his arms crossed over his chest, a smirk plastered across his sharp, lizard-like face. He held a high-end gold Montblanc pen in his breast pocket, waiting for the moment he could hand it to me to seal my fate. I walked into the room alone. I didn't bring a team of lawyers. I didn't carry a mountain of briefcases. I wore a simple tailored black dress, my hair pulled back into a tight professional bun. My only accessory was my grandfather's ruined gold pocket watch, held tightly inside my left palm, the sharp broken glass pressing into my skin to keep me grounded. I didn't look like an heiress fighting for her life. I looked like a woman who had accepted her defeat. As I took my seat at the far end of the table, the contrast was absolute. They were the victors, basking in the glow of stolen power. I was the outcast, silenced, isolated, and stripped of my resources. "Let's get this over with," Julian said, his voice loud and impatient, cutting through the silence of the room. "We don't have all day, Elena. Sign the quitclaim deeds, sign the assumption agreement, and you can take your little cardboard boxes and disappear." Richard Vance stepped forward, sliding a thick stack of heavy linen paper across the polished wood. "The document stops right in front of me. As discussed, Elena," Vance said, his tone dripping with a patronizing, oily smoothness. "These are the absolute, unconditional transfer certificates for the Manhattan commercial complexes and the Hamptons Resort. By signing these along with the absolute asset assumption agreement, you voluntarily waive any and all future claims to the Pendleton estate. In exchange, my clients have graciously agreed to withhold filing the corporate embezzlement dossier with the district attorney. It's a very generous offer for someone in your position. I looked down at the paperwork. I let my eyes trace the cold, black lines of the text. I didn't show the ice running through my veins. Instead, I let my shoulders drop slightly. I forced a small, weary, submissive smile to appear on my face. I looked up at Victoria, letting my voice sound soft, broken, and entirely defeated. I just want it to be over. I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly. You won. I don't have the strength to fight you anymore. If this is what it takes to protect my name and get my life back, I will comply. I voluntarily give up everything. I reached out and picked up the gold pen. I didn't hesitate. With a fluid, elegant motion, I signed my name at the bottom of the first quitclaim deed. Elena Pendleton. The blue ink flowed smoothly onto the expensive paper. I turned the page and signed the second one. Then I pulled the absolute asset assumption agreement toward me. This was the document Vance had added to permanently gag me. I signed that too, my signature crisp, dark, and legally binding. The moment I set the pen down, a sudden frantic energy shifted in the room. The absolute peak of their blind, insatiable greed erupted. Julian's eyes widened, a primal predatory instinct taking over. He actually leaned across the table, his hand shooting out to snatch the documents before I could change my mind. But Victoria was faster. Her diamond-encrusted hand slammed down on the papers, pulling them toward her son. Give me the pen, Julian. Sign it now, she hissed, her voice shedding all its upper-class sophistication, revealing the raw, ugly vulture underneath. They practically fought over the gold pen, their faces twisted in a grotesque display of desperation. Julian grabbed it from her, his fingers shaking with adrenaline as he scribbled his signature into the transferee section. Victoria snatched it next, signing her name right beneath his with an aggressive, jagged stroke. They were panting slightly, their chests rising and falling, completely consumed by the ecstatic rush of final absolute ownership. They had just swallowed the bait. The seconds that followed became an eternity. The signatures were dry. The documents were legally executed. Then the trap snapped shut. Arthur Sterling, who had quietly entered the room through the back door moments before, stood up from the shadow of the corner. He stepped into the light of the chandelier, his face a mask of grim, absolute authority. He didn't look like a fired lawyer anymore. He looked like an executioner. Next to him, Judge Reynolds stood up, his face entirely devoid of warmth, his eyes fixed firmly on Julian and Victoria. Mr. Vance, Judge Reynolds said, his voice a deep, booming baritone that shook the very air in the room. As a retired officer of the court, I am now taking official custody of these executed documents. And as of this exact second, this proceeding is under federal jurisdiction. Julian froze. His hand, which had been reaching for his whiskey glass, stopped dead in midair. The smile on his face didn't fade. It solidified into a strange, twisted grimace. The absolute stillness of the room became agonizing. It was the moment of the freeze. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted from Judge Reynolds to Arthur Sterling, her mind desperately trying to calculate what was happening. Richard Vance's face underwent a terrifying physical transformation. The smug, arrogant smirk was instantly wiped clean, replaced by a pasty, sickly green pallor. His jaw went slack, his eyes widening as he looked at the specific red-stamped folder Arthur Sterling was now opening on the table. A single thick bead of sweat formed at Julian's hairline, slowly tracking its way down his temple, cutting through his expensive bronzer, dripping onto his immaculate white collar. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The air in the room felt like liquid lead. The silence was so profound that the soft, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like a countdown to an explosion. They were completely paralyzed, caught in the terrifying realization that the broken girl they had been tormenting hadn't surrendered at all. She had just led them directly to the scaffold. I leaned back in my chair. The submissive, broken look on my face vanished, replaced by the razor-sharp, lethal calm of a forensic analyst who had just balanced the books. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my iPad and tapped the screen. A massive interconnected financial flowchart projected onto the large monitors on the boardroom wall. Let's look at the actual math of your victory, Julian, I said, my voice cutting through the frozen silence like an Arctic wind. You were so incredibly desperate to take the Manhattan commercial buildings that you completely forgot to ask why my grandfather cross-collateralized them. 6 months ago, I initiated a comprehensive voluntary forensic audit with the Internal Revenue Service. I provided them with every single piece of data regarding the Delaware and Cayman shell companies you and Victoria used to siphon money from the trust. Julian tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land, but no sound came out. By signing that absolute asset assumption agreement just now, I continued, tapping the screen to highlight a massive red-bordered legal clause, you didn't just take the buildings. You legally triggered a clause known as corporate liability consolidation. Under Title 26 of the United States Code, Section 7201, you have just officially voluntarily accepted personal, unlimited liability for $35 million in unpaid federal taxes, penalties, and accumulated interest. You didn't just pierce your own corporate veil, Julian. You shattered it. You took that massive toxic debt out of the corporate shell and tied it directly to your personal social security number and Victoria's private estate. Richard Vance finally found his voice, though it sounded thin, cracked, and completely terrified. This is fraud. The transfer was done under duress. It's invalid. Duress, Mr. Vance? Arthur Sterling stepped forward, his voice dripping with absolute scorn. Judge Reynolds just witnessed your clients practically tearing the pen out of Elena's hand to sign. There is a continuous high-definition video recording of this entire meeting being streamed directly to a secure federal server. You demanded this agreement. You drafted the timeline. You forced her to comply. This is the purest definition of malicious compliance. You got exactly what you legally demanded, and now you have to live with the execution. I turned my gaze to Victoria, whose hands were now shaking so violently that her platinum bracelets clinked together like cheap tin. And let's talk about your dream of selling the Hamptons resort to your Russian investors, Julian, I said, the mathematical precision of my words hammering the final nails into their coffin. You signed a binding letter of intent and accepted a $10 million advance deposit on a property with a clouded title. Because you signed the transfer today without a federal tax clearance certificate, you automatically triggered a cross-default acceleration clause with Deutsche Bank. The entire $50 million mortgage on that resort is now due in full. Within 30 days. I paused, letting the numbers sink into their panic-stricken brains. The Russian consortium has a very strict non-performance clause. Since the property is now frozen by an immediate IRS tax lien, you cannot deliver the title. That $10 million deposit you already spent to clear your Macau gambling markers? Under federal law, that constitutes wire fraud and grand larceny. The Russians will be suing you for treble damages, $30 million by Monday morning. You are not rich, Julian. You are not the head of this empire. As of 3 minutes ago, you and your mother are officially completely bankrupt. Your homes, your cars, your jewelry, your bank accounts. The government is going to seize every single asset you possess to satisfy the debt. The sheer, crushing weight of the legal reality hit them like a physical blow. The absolute satisfaction of watching their arrogance disintegrate into pure, unadulterated terror was an indescribable feeling. It was a biological rush of moral justice. The exact system they had weaponized to isolate me, to freeze my accounts, and to brand me as insane had just turned around and crushed them beneath its massive, uncaring wheels. Julian's knees literally gave out. He fell forward, his hands slamming against the mahogany table, before sliding down until he was on his knees on the very floor where he had crushed my grandfather's photograph just an hour ago. He looked up at me, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and pooling with tears of absolute panic. "Elena, please." He choked out, his voice a pathetic, wheezing sob. "We're family. You can't do this to me. I'll give it back. I'll give everything back. Just call off the IRS. Please, I can't go to prison." Victoria looked as though she had aged 20 years in a matter of minutes. She slumped back into my grandfather's leather chair, her mouth gaping open, staring at the flashing red numbers on the projector screen. The 5-carat diamond necklace around her neck suddenly looked like a noose. "Family?" I asked, looking down at Julian with a cold, detached pity. Family doesn't bribe doctors to let an old man die alone. Family doesn't weaponize a daughter's grief and medical history to plaster it on the front page of a tabloid. You told me that power dictates the truth, Julian. You told me that cash is king. Well, it turns out, intelligence is the ultimate sovereign. You played your game with greed and intimidation. I played mine with the Internal Revenue Manual and the United States Tax Court. And I don't lose. Before another word could be muttered, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open with a resounding thud. 4 sharply dressed special agents from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division walked in, accompanied by 2 New York State police officers. The lead agent, Sarah Jenkins, walked directly past Richard Vance, ignoring his pale, trembling form, and stepped up to Julian. Julian Pendleton? Victoria Pendleton. Agent Jenkins announced, her voice echoing off the wood panels. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit grand larceny, federal tax evasion, and wire fraud. Stand up and put your hands behind your back. The boardroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of pathetic screams and frantic crying. Julian wailed like a child as the steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around his wrists. Victoria screamed obscenities, kicking at the officers as they dragged her out of my grandfather's chair. Her expensive Chanel jacket tearing in the scuffle. Richard Vance stood entirely motionless, staring at his own hands, knowing his license was gone and a federal indictment was already being printed with his name on it. They were marched out of the penthouse, down the long corridor, past the rows of stunned employees who were watching the entire corporate dynasty collapse in real time. The media outlets they had bought to destroy me were already waiting downstairs, their cameras flashing frantically as the once powerful Pendletons were shoved into the back of dirty police cruisers. The room finally fell silent again. The air felt clean, the suffocating tension completely washed away. Arthur Sterling walked over to me, a warm, genuine smile filling his eyes. He reached into his coat pocket and handed me a small velvet pouch. Inside was a heavy silver key stamped with the emblem of the Union Bank of Switzerland. Your grandfather's real legacy is safe, Elena, Sterling said softly. The $80 million from his international maritime insurance policies and private overseas holdings was successfully settled into an independent, clean offshore trust 3 months ago. It is entirely free of any liability, completely untainted by the corporate structure, and it belongs exclusively to you. You're free. I took the key, feeling its cool, solid weight in my palm. I walked over to the floor, knelt down, and picked up the broken silver frame holding the picture of my grandfather and me. I brushed the dust and glass away from his smiling face. The psychological release was absolute. The burden of his legacy, the pain of their betrayal, the isolation. It was all gone. I stood up, took a deep breath of the fresh, clean air flowing through the open balcony door, and walked out of the boardroom. I didn't look back at the mahogany table or the empty leather chairs. I stepped into the elevator, descended to the street level, and walked out into the bright, brilliant Manhattan sunshine, completely free, completely independent, and entirely vindicated. If it were you, caught in a web of family betrayal and pushed to the absolute edge by people who wanted to destroy your life, would you choose this elegant, legal, but utterly ruthless revenge to make them destroy themselves, or would you have chosen a different path, or perhaps even forgiven them to find your own peace? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.